Hi there, and thank you for joining Change I Am Possible, India's first future tech podcast. Do kindly subscribe, support, and share. So today we talk about consciousness. The dictionary defines consciousness as the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surrounding. But we are pretty clueless of what consciousness is, right? We don't even know which part of the brain does consciousness reside in. Are animals conscious? Are comatose patients conscious? So these are still uncharted territory and which we are still discovering and trying to figure out. Though we have given consciousness various names or terms, we call it soul, awareness, mind, but we are nowhere close to understanding what consciousness is, and it's the most debatable, most puzzling and controversial subject. So I spoke with Michael Graziano, professor of psychology and neuroscience at the Princeton University. He is also the author of Rethinking Consciousness. So he's got a theory, which is calling it mechanistic theory or the attention schema theory, which posits that consciousness is informational and not mysterious or magical as we have thought. So his attention schema theory says that we can someday artificially engineer consciousness, and someday we'll be able to upload our brains and the consciousness of a person into a machine for a digital afterlife. So it was a lovely and insightful conversation to understand where the future of mankind is going. I wish you enjoyed this conversation.
I for information, M for mysterious. Here's how I consciousness works.
He explains I consciousness as the mechanistic part, the part that processes information, that relays inputs to outputs, and that is observable in the brain. It is also this part that we can pretty successfully build artificially. I consciousness, however, does not account for the subjective experience of these mechanisms, for that mysterious, seemingly non-materialistic part of our consciousness, the ghost in the machine, so to say.
Tell me, let's just start with the most easiest question. What is consciousness?
Oh my God. There are two basic approaches to this question of consciousness, at least today. And one of them you could call the mystical approach, and the other you could call the mechanistic approach. And the more mystical approach is perhaps the one most people are familiar with. This notion that there's this consciousness essence. It's kind of a type of magic. It's non-physical, it's mysterious, it's probably something nobody can ever understand. People have referred to it as the hard problem, which is a euphemism, meaning the problem that nobody can ever solve. The more mystical approach is, as I said, this approach that's probably more familiar to people. But there is a more mechanistic approach that's becoming more common in psychology, in neuroscience, and in philosophy. And that's the approach that really I've been working on as well. And in that way of thinking, first of all, the brain is a massive biological machine. It processes information. It is a trillion-stranded sculpture made out of information. Massively complicated, but it is information. It's something that can be understood mechanistically as information. And one of the things this machine does is build descriptions or models of itself. And for efficiency, those models are simplified. Those models are not perfectly accurate. They're not supposed to be accurate. They're quick and dirty models, quick and dirty ways the machine can keep track of and understand itself. And it's that kind of self-narrative, self-description that's giving us these kind of mystical, physically incoherent descriptions of a non-physical mind, of a kind of floaty consciousness magic. So in that mechanistic side, what we call consciousness is a massively, hugely complicated machine building a kind of simplified, cartoonish model of itself.
Right.
And then,
right.
of course, the mystical side is something else entirely.
Right. So which part of the brain do you think holds consciousness, and how is consciousness produced?
It's a little hard to pinpoint a part of the brain. Neuroscientists these days tend to talk more in terms of networks. So many areas that are hooked together that are doing computations by processing and sending information back and forth between them. And it looks like there is a network that may be particularly involved in this whole issue of consciousness. It's a network sometimes called the theory of mind network or the social cognition network. It's involved in how we look at other people and envision what's going on in their minds. And we build narratives and little models and ideas of what's going on inside other people's minds. And it looks like the same kind of areas are involved in building the same kinds of descriptions, but for ourselves as well. And so this is the network that if you ask the brain, are you conscious? Tell us about consciousness. This is the only network that even knows what that word means, that can even answer that question. It's the network that builds the whole construct of what a mind is, what it means to have a mind.
Right. So you have been your theory, mechanistic theory of consciousness. You also call it the attention schema theory. So which speculates that a cognitive properties can be engineered. It could be uploaded onto a non-biological substrate, a machine, avatar, robot, or whatever. So can you just talk about the attention schema theory?
The attention schema theory, this is something we've been working on for about a decade, a little more than a decade now. And it has, in one form or another, been gaining ground. There, I think, is a lot of enthusiasm about this theory in, as I said, this one mechanistic side of thinking about consciousness. There's always controversy because there's always people who think consciousness is magic and can never be understood scientifically. And a surprising number of scientists subscribe to that view as well. So there's always controversy. But within the more mechanistic thinking, this attention schema theory, I think, has some very strong grounding. And it's essentially what I described to you a moment ago. The brain builds cartoonish models of itself. And one of the most important thing a brain does is something that psychologists call attention. Attention, of course, is a word we use colloquially, but what psychologists and neuroscientists mean specifically is the brain has an ability to focus its resources on a small number of items and process them really deeply. And so that's a data handling method, and it's something that's mechanistic. You can build it into computers. People have done so. So the brain, in a sense, seizes on something and knows about it and can respond to it. And in this theory, the reason why we say we have consciousness with all these extravagant properties to it is because the brain is specifically trying to describe to itself what it's doing when it's focusing attention. So the attention schema, there's attention and then there's a schema, i.e. a description, a sort of cartoonish, not quite accurate self-description. And that's what we're tapping into when we say, oh, I have a non-physical way inside of me of knowing things and mentally possessing things and being conscious of things.
Right. So are you implicating that someday we will be able to map our entire cognitive structure and possibly then upload it onto a computer? Are you saying that?
Yes. So if this mechanistic approach is correct, and I'm pretty sure it is, I think the last 100 years, 150 years of neuroscience tells us that the brain is a big biological information processing machine. If this approach is correct, and in specific, if this kind of theory, like the attention schema theory, is correct, then what we call the mind is 100% mechanistic. It's hugely complicated, ridiculously, vastly complicated. Though one should not minimize it. It's not a trivial thing, but it's entirely mechanistic. In principle, it could be copied or duplicated onto a different kind of platform. It's entirely possible. When that would happen is a different question. That may be very far in the future, but physically possible, yes.
Right. So yes, I mean, like, when you said that it's complicated, yes, I mean, we have somewhere around 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses, and the way they wire, it is so. I mean, when do you think we will come to a point where we will be able to understand our entire cognitive structure, what it does, a or sensory input, what it does? When do you think we will be able to achieve that? Because there are lots of people who are working on that. There's Elon Musk who's working on Neuralink. There's Brian Johnson who's working on this kernel. Facebook is doing their own thing. Ed Boyden is doing with optogenetics, and there's so many others. When do you think something like this is possible? And if it's possible, what would the world look like? What would be the impact of society? Like, I mean, when we can read our entire cognitive structure and can upload it onto maybe a computer or a avatar, a robot, what would be the world would look like? What would be the societal and cultural, ethical, moral implication of something like that? I'm sure there are lots of positive. Like, I mean, like in the movie Matrix, you'll be able to possibly upload so much information. Education industry would go for a toss, right? I mean, my son, when he grows up, could possibly just press a button, and he could just download all the entire information available on planet Earth. So what would be the implication of something like that?
So I'm going to start with your first question. When are we going to get there? There are a lot of people working on it. And you said something interesting. You said, when will we understand all those networks and connections, the cognitive structure, well enough to duplicate it? And I think the answer is you don't have to understand it. You just have to copy the details. For example, it is, in theory, possible to take the human genome and duplicate it and produce a clone. I mean, we can do this for non-mammals like Dolly the sheep. There's some reports people may have tried it in humans. It's not considered ethical to do it in humans. In principle, one can do that without understanding the genetic code, right? Most of what's in the genome, nobody understands. But how to copy it, that's a different question. That's a much more simple mechanistic question of how to get each little part of the code copied over to something else, and then you duplicate it. So the question of creating an artificial mind is not a matter of understanding the deep principles of how the brain works. It's a matter of merely, I say merely, scanning the pattern of connectivity in the brain and duplicating it. You don't have to know why everything's connected the way it is. You don't actually have to have any insight into how the brain really works. You just have to copy it. And so the problem's slightly simpler than what many people suppose it to be. It's a matter of copying without even necessarily understanding what you're copying. But as to how you copy the neural networks of a real brain into an artificial brain, that's of course quite a challenge unto itself. First of all, we already have artificial neurons that work very well. We have artificial networks of neurons of hundreds, thousands, even millions of neurons. We know a lot about those and how to engineer them. In fact, the modern world is predicated on that. Self-driving cars and our cell phones and all kinds of technology work on the basis of artificial neural networks. So those components are in place. We don't yet have a neural network, an artificial neural network as big as the human brain, but we're getting there. I mean, computer technology is progressing at a ridiculous pace. The thing we really don't have that may be a century or more in the future, the thing we don't have is an ability to scan an actual biological brain and scan all the little pattern of connectivity and figure out what neuron hooks to which one by how much, and then take that data. Once you have that data, you could copy it in an artificial system. But how do you get that data? How do you scan a person's actual physical brain at that level of detail? And that's something we don't have. We don't have anything close to it. The technology hasn't been invented yet. So it could be 100 years, it could be more than 100 years, I don't know. But at some point, it's in principle possible. And I'm sure at some point people will invent the scanning technology. And once that's invented, the problem is essentially solved. Copy a person's real brain, scan it, take that data and recreate it in artificial neural networks. And boom, there you have essentially a copy of that person's mind.
Would it be that simple where you just copy it? Wouldn't you actually require to understand the details of what the neurons does, what the synapses does? I mean,
No.
Yeah, so you could just possibly do. So what technology would kind of accelerate the scanning process? What I mean by is that, what do you think? Like there's people like Ed Boyden who's saying that maybe optogenetics could be one of the path forward. And like you said, in principle, yes, we can do it because I mean there have been various experiences where people have actually copied the neuronal structure of various animals. I mean, there's somebody who's actually copied the neuronal data of a C. elegans worm because just has 320 odd neurons, right? And they have copied it and put it on a connectome, a neural network, and at stimulation, it behaves exactly the same way what the physical one would do, right? So yeah, in principle, yes, it's possible. But what do you think would take for the scanning process to accelerate?
So you're right, the C. elegans brain with its 300 neurons has been mapped. It's called a connectome to map all the connections among the neurons, and it's been copied artificially. The problem is what you have to copy is actually a little more than just which neuron hooks to which other one. You also have to know how strong is that connection, and is it excitatory or inhibitory? And you have to know, is it a fast-acting connection or a slow one that moves over longer time scales? So you have to know, is this a neuron that secretes a hormone that will affect a lot of surrounding neurons? Or is this a neuron that has a connection very specific only to this other neuron? So there's a lot of things that are not actually scanned in something like these very initial connectomes, like the C. elegans connectome. So even though all 300 of its neurons have been mapped, the information actually still isn't entirely there to create a perfect little simulated avatar C. elegans living in a computer world. It's not quite there. So at that level, there's still more work to be done, even on the 300 neuron brain of the roundworm. But as for scanning the human brain, this is something nobody can do. Nobody can imagine doing. There are scanning methods like MRI, but they scan at such a poor resolution that maybe a millimeter of resolution. You can't get anything of this specificity out of it. There's the electron microscope. So in principle, you could kill someone and slice up their brain, and electron scan the whole brain and get some level of specificity. Even that's not good enough for this task. So it's far in the future. But I would say this, a little more than 100 years ago, 105 years ago, Albert Einstein predicted gravity waves. And he was absolutely certain that in no possible future would anyone ever measure them. Because the magnitude of a gravity wave is thousands of times smaller than the size of an atomic nucleus. And he said, well, this is silly. I mean, it's a nice theory. It's fun to think about, but nobody will ever confirm gravity waves. And almost exactly 100 years later, the equipment was in place. Gravity waves were confirmed. So technology has a way of moving forward. And if it's, gravity waves, people thought weren't even physically possible to measure. In terms of the details of the brain, Yes, of course, it's physically possible to measure. The question is, when will the technology catch up? And I don't know when that will be. It's impossible to predict. It could be like Einstein and the gravity waves 100 years, or it could be 300 years. It could be like um, Leonardo da Vinci tries to invent flying machines, and it takes 400 years before the Wright brothers. I don't know how long it will take, but I would say it's inevitable. It will definitely happen at some point.
Right. So what's been the community reaction, your scientific community, your peers' reaction on your theory?
Well, the theory is specifically about consciousness itself. What is it? Why do we go around claiming to have a mystery inside of us, a mysterious mind inside of us? Where does that claim come from? Every claim that we make, everything we insist about ourselves, derives ultimately from information inside this machine. Otherwise, if we didn't have the information, we wouldn't be able to talk about it. We wouldn't be able to make those claims or think those thoughts. So everything derives from that information. And this theory is about where that information comes from and what adaptive value it has. So why it would have evolved that way. So the theory is not specifically about how we can build artificial minds. The the theory is about this one specific component, the consciousness component. And I think the reaction's been wonderful. I mean, like I said, there's always controversy. There's always these two sides, and there's a lot of pushback always from the mystical side. People who really want consciousness to be something that science can never understand, and there's a lot of pushback from that. That's fine, but on the mechanistic end, I think there's a lot of interest. The theory is done very well. One of the main points I try to make when I discuss this theory is that it's actually not very much of a rival to some of the other theories. It hooks up very nicely to a lot of the existing theories. They kind of form pieces that can fit together into a larger whole. And so I don't like to think in terms of rivalries among these more mechanistic theories. I think everyone's working on the problem from a slightly different angle and seeing a little different piece of the puzzle, and all these pieces actually fit together nicely. And I think that's one of the benefits of my particular theory, is it really emphasizes those linkages.
Right. So people say that our brain is nothing but a information processing device. You also said the brain is just a machine. So our body, right? We have got trillions of cells. They use electricity to function, right? Our brains, it needs electricity, right? It fires because there's these electrons which are firing, right? It needs it. So in some ways, are we the machines? Are we the artificial general intelligence that we are looking outside or trying to build?
So we are certainly biological machines. And you're right, the body part of the machine has long since been understood in mechanistic terms. I mean, there was a time in history when muscles and movement of limbs was thought to be mysterious and magical. And now we understand the mechanism underlying that. The brain is part of that same machine. We are definitely biological machines. A lot of people would phrase it just as you did. Are we just machines? Are we merely machines? And actually, I would push back a little on that phraseology. I don't think that the magical soul or the magical mind is bigger than a mere machine. I think it goes the other way around. I think the machine, especially the mind, the brain, is more complicated than people realize. It's unbelievable. It's vast. Like I said, the mind is a trillion-stranded sculpture made out of information. That's the wonderful thing. That's the incredible part of it all. What people talk about as a magical mind or a soul, that's the simplification. That's this little cartoonish reduction into kind of a simple concept without working parts. That's, if you want to say, are we just A or B? I would say, are we really just a magical mind? No, that's too simple. We're actually something much bigger than that, much more wonderful than that, a machine of vast proportions of trillions of working parts. That's what we really are.
Right. So, there are these technologies like virtual reality, which is growing exponentially. It's not just virtual reality, right? Most of these emerging technologies are growing like in unimaginable space, right? So, for example, I've been vested in the VR space since 2016. So there's a simple and basic VR experience called a Ritchie's plank. I don't know whether you have experienced that. So what it does is basically when you don the VR headset, you go on top of a tower, and on the top of the tower, the terrace, there's this plank which is sticking out, and then the ones who are experiencing that content, I mean, you know that you're at your living room or wherever you are, and you're not on any tower or whatever, But as soon as you put the VR headset on, and you see that plank which is sticking on the terrace, and when you walk, you take the first few steps, you start trembling, and you feel that you're on top of the terrace because your motor cortex tricks you. So what is going on? And at this point in time, we are in such a nascent stage, right? I'm talking about now, let's jump into 30 years forward, right? What will happen when virtual reality starts blurring the lines of the physical reality and your virtual world? What happens in a situation like that?
First, I would say what you're talking about with this plank or stepping off a tall building in virtual reality, this is tapping into a reflex. We have very basic reflexes. Some are as simple as, the doctor whacks your knee and your leg kicks. That's a reflex, but that's a very simple one that doesn't even get up to your brain. That's all in your spinal cord. There are other reflexes that pass through your brain that are long lead multi-neuron reflexes, and some of these protective or defensive reflexes are among them. So stepping off a cliff is something that is reflexively wired into us not to do. Shying away from something that is flying at us, that's another one. In virtual reality, if a cannonball flies at your face, you'll duck. It takes a lot of repetition before you adapt to that stimulus and don't duck. So those are basic reflexes that we can't help at a cognitive level. And virtual reality definitely taps into those. I think as virtual reality gets better and more flexible, of course, people will probably spend more and more time in it. I don't know what that will do to us culturally, but people's imaginations are pretty good. So even with crude virtual reality, the brain is very forgiving. You look at a world that's not perfectly rendered, and the brain forgives all the little errors and treats it like a real world. So I'm excited by virtual reality. I would love to see it become more prevalent and more realistic. But
right. So please, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I guess the reason I put the point out about virtual reality is because there's this larger group of people who are saying that we are living in a simulation. And the reason I say this is because, today, we can create this simulated world, which kind of tricks our motor cortex. So the reason I put that point across about virtual reality is what will happen when maybe in 30 years down, we can build the simulation and you can't understand what is virtual and what is real. So because you said that your consciousness is mechanistic, and in some point in time, you will be able to map our brain and then kind of upload it onto a computer. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, you create a matrix-like situation, right? So if you create something like that, if that's possible, what is to say that that's not already been done and we are not already living in a simulation?
Well, of course, it's hard to refute that. But on the other hand, there's no evidence for that. And so at that point, I think that idea belongs in the sort of dorm room philosophy category of, there's no evidence for it. Nothing has ever indicated that. let's not, from the point of view of science, until evidence comes along, we won't worry about it too much. But you raised something very interesting. If you can copy the details of a person's brain in artificial neurons and effectively recreate that mind, that person's thinking and emotions and wisdom and knowledge, memories. So you create that person in a digital format. What kind of body are you going to give that person? And the cheap answer is a virtual body. And what kind of environment are you going to let that person run around in? The cheap answer is a virtual environment. So a virtual reality with a virtual brain in a virtual body. And when that virtual reality becomes really physically good enough, then that recreated brain would feel as though it's living in normal reality. So that if and when that happens, now you have an interesting case where there's real reality and virtual reality. But I suspect, this is my own guess, everyone can guess about the future and we'll never know till it comes. I suspect that if there is a kind of a virtual afterlife, as people call it, you upload minds to it and people have these virtual avatar bodies and they run around in some simulation. That virtual afterlife, I suspect, will have connections to the real world. That is, the two worlds can talk to each other, they can have phone calls, they can Skype with each other, they can keep track of what's going on in the other world, these people in that world. There's nothing to stop that any more than people in my part of the world and in your part of the world can talk and interact and like we're doing. So news can go back and forth. People in a virtual world could, in principle, hold jobs in the real world, as in you could be a CEO of a company, or you could be a sales representative, or you could be a teacher and interact entirely virtually with the real world. And so what happens is, what I'm guessing, and I think a lot of other people are guessing, is more like a larger collection of worlds that are all hooked together, that are all interacting with each other. And only one of them is the original physical world. But then there's all these virtual worlds, and yet they're still all talking to each other and all interacting with each other. And so probably something like that emerges. That's the guess.
Wow. So what is the area of your research, if you solved, you feel might open up the understanding of a brain consciousness?
I think the general principles are there. This is something people don't realize because there's so much mystique about consciousness, the thing that we can never understand and maybe in some distant future. No, I think the basic principles are there. I think we know essentially why it is that this machine claims to have a non-physical mind essence inside of it, right? So the general principles are there. The specific wiring of it, the details of it, that we don't know, we don't understand that yet. But the basic principles, I think, are there. And so I think as the research moves forward, what's being looked at are those details, exactly which networks in the brain, what happens when those networks are disrupted, like if you have a stroke. What about other animals? Can we take those principles to other animals and ask, okay, which animals have this same property to them? Which animals are going around thinking to themselves, yeah, I'm conscious? And how can we tell that? How can we look in the brain and make those kinds of assessments? So I think this is what's moving forward in the research.
Lovely, lovely. So thank you, Michael. Really appreciate you talking with us. And is there any last words that you would like to share with the listeners? And if there's anything that I haven't asked you, which you would like to share with the listeners?
I don't think so. That was a good set of questions.
Lovely, lovely. So thank you, Michael. Really appreciate you being part of Change My Possible podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see, please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. So